The wind had teeth that night, sharp, dry, and relentless. Dust coiled along the fence posts like snakes searching for shelter, and the stars above hung low, heavy with silence. Jedediah Crane had just finished nailing a broken hinge on the chicken coop when he heard it, a sound too soft to be a coyote, too desperate to be the wind. At the edge of his land, crumpled beneath the moonlight, was the figure of a woman, barefoot, breathless, pregnant, her dress torn by miles of travel, her hands trembling, her lips cracked from thirst. And as he ran to her, calling out, she collapsed against the gate without a word. In the Old West, strangers didn't come without purpose, and they rarely came alone. But this woman bore no name, no wagon, no companion, only the swollen curve of a belly too close to its moment, and eyes that held both terror and something fiercer than fear, hope. Jed lifted her into his arms, not with grace, but with urgency. He didn't think. He didn't question. He just moved. Into the barn they went, where warmth clung to the walls and hay softened the earth. He yelled for his sister, Ruth, who came running with towels, hot water, and the steadiness of a midwife who'd seen too much to be shaken. What happened over the next few hours was not a birth. It was a battle. Between life and death. Between past and future. Between a woman who refused to give up and a man who had long ago convinced himself he was done caring about anything. The barn filled with the sounds of pain, of breath held and lost, of whispered prayers between contractions. Jed paced outside the stall, hands buried in his hair, cursing every god he'd ever heard of, until at last the air shifted and a cry rang out. Not hers, a baby's. He stepped inside and saw the miracle with his own eyes, a tiny girl, wailing like thunder, wrapped in an old feed sack. The woman, pale but alive, cradled her child like she'd fought every mile of that prairie just to reach this exact moment. She looked up at Jed, not as a stranger, but as a man who had unknowingly saved 2 lives that night. "Thank you," she whispered. "We had nowhere left to go." And in that instant, something inside him broke. Or maybe it mended. Either way, Jed Crane, who had buried his heart years before, felt it beat again. This is the story of what brought her there, of what kept her alive, of the baby born under a tin roof and beside old saddles. But more than that, it's a story of how one moment can change everything, of how a man who thought he was finished found himself needed in the most human way, and of how, in the quiet corners of the West, where dust often buries more than footprints, something sacred still finds a way to rise. By morning, the barn smelled of fresh straw, steam, and new life. The baby, small, red, fierce, slept wrapped in Ruth's old quilt, nestled in a makeshift cradle made from a grain basket. The mother, still too weak to stand, lay resting on a pile of hay softened by every clean blanket the homestead could spare. Jed sat by the open barn doors, boots in the dirt, hat in hand, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He hadn't planned on becoming part of someone's beginning. For years, all he had known were endings. He watched the wind tug at the woman's torn dress where it hung on a nail. It was stained with blood and dust, 2 kinds of pain the West knew all too well. She hadn't said much after the birth. Just her name, Claire. No last name, no details, only that she'd come from east of the Rio Pecos, walking for nearly 4 days, sleeping in dry riverbeds, eating what little she'd packed in a flour sack. She said something had happened, but didn't say what. Jed didn't ask. In the West, pain traveled like thunder. You heard it before you saw it. And when it reached your door, you didn't question the lightning. You just braced yourself. Ruth, with her steady hands and eyes that had weathered worse storms than the sky ever threw, never once hesitated. She moved through the barn like she'd done this before. And she had, 12 times in her life, helping women who had nowhere else to go. This one, though, was different. She saw it in the way Claire clung to that baby like the world might try to take her away. Ruth brought broth, boiled water, whispered things meant to soothe, not just the body but the soul. And Claire, who hadn't let herself cry once during labor, finally broke down when Ruth tucked a curl behind her ear. As the sun climbed, Jed finally spoke. "You got anyone looking for you?" Claire looked up, her voice hoarse. "Not anymore." He nodded. He knew what that meant. There were some stories you didn't have to be told. They were written in the way a woman stared too long at a door before closing it, in the way she flinched at footsteps, or how she held a child not just out of love, but out of fear that something might come back to claim her. That evening, as the shadows grew long and the barn turned gold, Jed brought Claire a piece of cornbread and some cool water. She took it with shaking hands. The baby stirred, then cried, and Claire cradled her against her chest, humming a song that didn't sound like it belonged to any place in particular. Jed sat across from her in silence. He didn't know what he was supposed to do with all this. But deep down, somewhere beneath the dust and grief and years of pushing people away, he knew one thing. He couldn't send her back into the wilderness. By the third day, Claire could stand, barefoot, leaning against a post, her knees still unsteady, but upright. It was a kind of triumph that didn't need applause. She didn't speak much, but her actions filled in the silence. She helped Ruth fetch water, folded laundry with slow, deliberate care, and cleaned out the chicken coop without being asked. The baby, now named Eliza, slept often, waking only to feed or cry out in the small hours of dawn. Her presence shifted something in the house. The walls no longer echoed as they had. The barn doors stayed open longer. The porch felt lived in again. Jed found himself drawn to the child in a way he didn't expect. He'd never held a baby before, and the first time Claire placed Eliza in his arms, his hands froze midair like they weren't sure they had the right. But when the baby settled into his chest, warm and tiny and trusting, something ancient stirred inside him. Not fatherhood. You wouldn't dare think that. But protection. A kind of wordless promise that if the world came for her, it'd have to go through him first. One afternoon, Ruth caught Jed carving a small wooden horse from a block of pine. He said it was just to pass the time, but Ruth saw through him. "You're not as cold as you pretend to be," she murmured. "That child's already melted half your insides." Jed didn't argue. He just kept carving. He hadn't realized how much he needed the sound of laughter, the scent of fresh bread, the soft, chaotic rhythm of a baby's cry cutting through a life that had grown too still. But trouble, in the Old West, rarely stayed far behind. That evening, as Jed fed the horses and Claire nursed Eliza beneath a blanket, a rider passed along the ridge, slow, lingering, just out of rifle range. Jed's jaw tensed. He didn't wave. Neither did the rider. They watched each other for a moment too long before the man turned his horse and disappeared behind the hills. Jed said nothing to Claire, but he checked the rifle that night. Twice. The days were growing longer, warmer. The land was waking up. And yet, a shadow had crept back into Jed's chest, the old kind. The one that whispered of men who didn't forget, of tracks that led to doors, no matter how remote. He didn't know who Claire had run from, or what lines she had crossed. But now that she was here, now that that baby had been born beneath his roof, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't letting harm come near her. Not again. Not ever. A week later, the rider returned. This time, he didn't linger on the ridge. He came right up the path, slow as a prayer, dust trailing behind his horse like a veil of smoke. Jed was already waiting on the porch, rifle across his lap, legs wide, steady. Claire stayed inside. Eliza pressed tight against her chest, breath shallow. Ruth stood by the window, holding a kitchen knife not for cooking, but for whatever came through that door if Jed didn't stop it. The man dismounted without a word. He was lean, sharp-featured, the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved from sun-baked rock. His boots crunched over the gravel as he approached. "I'm looking for a girl," he said, voice dry as the prairie wind. "Ran off a while back. Heard she might have passed this way." Jed didn't move. A lot of folks passed this way. Storms. Coyotes. But no girl. The man squinted, reading Jed's face. She was carrying a child. Jed stood up then, slow, deliberate, and placed the butt of the rifle on the floorboards. "Still don't know her," he said, his voice a low thunder. There was a pause, long and tight as a cocked hammer. The man didn't reach for his gun. He just stared at Jed like he was weighing the cost of pushing further. But there was something in Jed's stance, something too steady to challenge. The rider spit in the dirt. "If she comes through here, you tell her I'm looking." Jed nodded once. "I'll be sure to forget." The man turned, climbed back on his horse, and rode off without another word. But his eyes, dark, bitter, burned with something that didn't disappear in the distance. That night, Jed boarded up the old shed behind the barn and reinforced the locks on the back windows. He didn't say why, but no one asked. The house was quieter again. The baby's cries seemed louder against the stillness. Claire tried to apologize once, but Jed cut her off. "You don't owe me nothing. Just keep that child close. I'll handle the rest." It wasn't kindness. It was purpose. Jed had finally been given a reason to fight again, and he wasn't about to waste it. Meanwhile, Ruth began teaching Claire how to fire a revolver. They practiced in the fields behind the creek, far enough not to draw attention, close enough to be quick if needed. Claire's hands trembled the first few times, but her eyes stayed focused. She hit the tink and on the sixth shot, then the fifth, then the third. "You'll never be helpless again," Ruth said, hand on her shoulder. Claire didn't smile, but she nodded, because now she believed it. The days grew hotter, and the land began to crack under the pressure of a dry spring. But inside the farmhouse, something unexpected was blooming. Eliza was now 2 weeks old, strong-lunged and wide-eyed. She had a cry like a prairie hawk and a grip that made even Ruth chuckle. Claire's cheeks began to color again. Her steps grew more certain. She would rock Eliza on the porch while humming a song no one recognized, but all found comforting. Jed, often fixing fence posts nearby, would find himself pausing just to listen. Claire began baking, not out of duty, but because she needed something to put her hands to. The smell of cornbread, fresh biscuits, and wild mint tea filled the kitchen most days. Ruth, surprised at first, welcomed the help. They worked side by side like they'd been raised in the same house, not thrown together by fate. They didn't talk much, but their silence felt like stitching, not distance. And when they did speak, it was always soft, never rushed. Like everything else in that house, it was earned. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the western hills, Claire asked Jed a question that took him off guard. "Did you ever lose someone?" Jed didn't answer for a long time. He just looked out over the horizon, then nodded once. "My wife," he said, "a long time ago. Took me longer to forgive myself than to bury her." Claire didn't press. She just placed a hand gently over his, not as a gesture of pity, but as recognition. Wounds like theirs didn't always need words. They just needed witness. The peace didn't erase the danger, but it gave them all something worth defending. Jed knew the rider might return, maybe with others, maybe worse, but he also knew the land better than anyone else within 100 miles. He began setting traps along the eastern ridge, dug new holes near the creek, just in case. Not because he expected war, but because he understood the West didn't forgive weakness, and now he had something that made him strong again. And when Eliza laughed for the first time, squealing in the arms of a man who'd once forgotten what joy felt like, Claire looked at Jed with eyes that said everything she hadn't been able to voice. "Thank you for saving us, for staying, for standing still long enough for something real to take root." And Jed, who never thought himself the kind of man to hold a future in his arms, found himself holding it anyway, and refusing to let it go. The heat clung to the earth like a heavy coat, and the sky stretched wide and unbroken above the plains. In that stillness, Hollow Bend, what Ruth had started calling the ranch, began to feel less like a hiding place and more like a beginning. Claire woke earlier now, rising with the sun, feeding the chickens while Eliza lay swaddled on the porch swing. Jed would often return from the fields to find Claire humming, eyes distant but peaceful, her hands busy in the rhythm of a life she never thought she'd have again. But in the distance, trouble rippled. Tracks appeared by the creek that none of them recognized. Boots, not hooves. Ruth found them first. She didn't panic, but she did tighten the perimeter. Jed set new traps, closer this time, and Claire started sleeping with the pistol Ruth had given her resting beside the crib. They didn't say it aloud, but the truth hung in the air like dust before a stampede. The rider hadn't given up. That night, while Eliza slept and the others sat on the porch sipping cool tea, Claire told the rest of her story. She spoke quietly, with her eyes fixed on the edge of the night. The man she fled from wasn't her husband. He was her captor, a gambler who lost her in a deal and kept her like property. When she found out she was pregnant, she waited for her chance, stole a canteen and a broken compass, and vanished under moonlight. She hadn't stopped running until she collapsed at Jed's gate. There was no judgment, no pity, only silence that wrapped her like a blanket. Ruth leaned over and squeezed her hand. Jed simply nodded, then got up to check the barn one more time. Not because he feared what was coming, but because he refused to be unprepared again. The woman who now called his land home had walked through fire to be there. And by God, he wasn't going to let that fire return. The next morning, Jed took Eliza in his arms while Claire cooked breakfast. The baby giggled, grabbing at his collar, and for a moment, he saw his own reflection in her tiny eyes. Not the man he had been, scarred, silent, lost, but the man he was now. Anchored, present, worthy. That child had been born into his world by chance, but she had rooted herself there by grace. And grace, Jed now understood, wasn't something given. It was something you chose to carry forward. Summer deepened, and with it came a sense of both belonging and urgency. The wildflowers that lined the property bloomed like they knew time was short. Even the wind felt charged, like it carried messages between the branches. The days were good, quiet, warm, full of laughter and work, but everyone could feel the shadow just beyond the tree line. Jed never said it, but Ruth knew. Danger was near. Claire felt it too. She had stopped asking if it would come. She now asked only when. So they trained. Ruth took Claire out every morning before sunrise, showing her how to move silently through tall grass, how to reload under pressure, how to breathe through the fear. Jed, meanwhile, taught her how to read the signs in the land. Crushed blades of grass, broken twigs, smoke that didn't belong. Eliza would be strapped to Claire's back in a sling as she practiced. This wasn't fear. This was preparation. A mother sharpening herself into something unbreakable. It was a quiet Sunday when the dogs began barking. Not frantic, but deep, rhythmic, certain. Jed stepped onto the porch, eyes squinting toward the road. Dust. 3 horses. Same lean silhouette leading the way. This time, the rider didn't stop at the ridge. He came straight for the house. Behind him rode 2 others, hard men, slow smiles, their hands too close to their belts. Jed called for Ruth. Claire was already inside, locking shutters, tucking Eliza in the root cellar. This wasn't a visit. It was a test. Jed stood in the yard, rifle in hand, as the riders dismounted. The lead man looked at him like they were old friends. Told you I was looking for someone, he said, voice slick as oil. Heard she's been seen here. With a child. Jed didn't blink. Ain't no one here belonging to you. One of the other men spat in the dirt. We don't need permission to look. Jed cocked the rifle. You'll need resurrection if you try. For a long second, the west stood still. Not a bird. Not a breeze. Just 3 men facing one, and the weight of something holy standing behind him. Because Jed wasn't alone. Ruth had the high window covered. Claire was behind the door, steady and ready. And in that charged silence, the riders made their choice. The lead man smiled, tight, bitter, and said, "This ain't over." Then they mounted and rode away, leaving only hoof prints and heat behind them. But as Jed watched them disappear into the horizon, he knew something had changed. They wouldn't come back unprepared, and neither would he. The night after the confrontation settled like a heavy blanket over Hollow Bend. No one said much. There was no celebration, no false sense of victory. Only the crackle of the hearth and the weight of what they all knew. This was the calm before the real storm. Claire held Eliza close, her body curved protectively around her, while Jed sat at the table sharpening his knife in slow, measured strokes. Ruth moved with purpose, gathering dried herbs, restocking water jugs, checking every window twice. In the early hours, Claire woke to the sound of a creaking floorboard. Not fear, but instinct. She found Jed on the porch, rocking slowly in his father's old chair, rifle beside him, the edge of the sky just beginning to pale. He didn't look at her as she stepped beside him. "They'll come at night," he said, voice low. "Men like that don't like sunlight. Too many eyes." Claire nodded. "And if they do?" He turned to her then, and in his eyes was something solid as the land beneath them. "They'll find we don't scare easy." Over the next few days, they worked like a well-oiled machine. Ruth laid out escape plans, should the worst happen. She taught Claire how to use the terrain around the house to her advantage, where the trees offered cover, where the creek ran shallow enough to cross. Jed built barriers, reinforced the barn with planks thick enough to stop bullets. He even buried a stash of supplies behind the well. Rifle cartridges, canned food, bandages. This wasn't panic. This was survival. And Hollow Bend had no intention of going quietly. Eliza, unaware of the storm gathering beyond the hills, continued to grow like a wildflower. Laughing now, her eyes bright with a trust that somehow softened everyone who held her. Jed especially. He would take her on long walks at dusk, speaking to her in the kind of voice no one had heard from him in years, gentle, patient, full of wonder. "You're not just part of this land," he told her once, pressing her tiny hand against the bark of the cottonwood. "You are the reason it's worth defending." Then, on the sixth night, a dog howled. Not a warning, but a signal. Claire bolted upright in bed, heart pounding. Ruth lit the lantern with practice calm. Jed was already at the front door, loading the shotgun with a speed born from memory. The moon outside was high and full, casting silver across the fields. And there, on the far side of the fence, came the soft thud of hooves. 3 riders. No more posturing. No more threats. This time, they had come to claim what they thought was theirs. But Hollow Bend had never belonged to them, and tonight they would learn why. The riders dismounted without hesitation. No words this time. Just steel drawn from holsters and shadows gliding across the field. Jed crouched behind the porch railing, eyes steady through the rifle's sights. Claire was upstairs, rifle barrel peeking from the bedroom window. Ruth, near the barn, waited with quiet fury in her gut. The moon bore witness to the tension. 3 souls defending one home, one child, one second chance that none of them would surrender. The first shot came from the dark. Missed wide. Jed answered with a blast that shattered the night. One of the intruders ducked and rolled behind the trough. The second tried circling the barn, but Ruth was waiting. Her shot hit wood, but it was enough to send the rider scrambling back into view. Claire, heartbeat like a drum in her chest, aimed and fired from the upstairs window. Her bullet struck the ground inches from their leader's boots. Close enough to send a message: "We will not break." The attackers regrouped, confused by the resistance. This wasn't a frightened woman in the desert. This was a family forged in survival. They shouted to one another, tried to flank, but the traps Jed had laid did their work. One rider fell hard, howling in pain as barbed wire snapped around his leg. The others hesitated. Seconds passed. Then came the voice, from Claire, loud and firm from the window: "Leave now, or you don't leave at all." Silence. Then retreat. Slow at first, then a gallop into the trees. They didn't fire another shot. Didn't even look back. The dust from their horses lingered in the air like smoke. Jed lowered his rifle, breathing slow. Ruth emerged from the barn, face calm but pale. Claire stood on the porch with Eliza now in her arms. Safe. Untouched. Hollow Bend had held. Not because of firepower, but because of love, resolve, and a truth deeper than fear. That night, they didn't sleep. They sat by the fire until sunrise, not speaking much, just existing together, alive, whole, stronger than they'd ever known. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, not howling this time, but whispering, like it had seen everything, and offered its quiet respect. The dawn that followed didn't feel like victory. It felt like breath, like the slow exhale of a house that had held its ground through the weight of a storm. Hollow Bend stood untouched, but changed. The barn doors hung, open to let in the light. The porch still bore the scuff marks of boots and bullets, but the air smelled of coffee, of wood smoke, and something else: relief. No one cheered. No one spoke of triumph. Because in the Old West, survival wasn't glory, it was grace. Jed moved through the yard with deliberate steps, checking traps, scanning the tree line, repairing the fence where one of the riders had tried to climb over. Claire watched him from the porch, Eliza asleep against her chest, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the baby's hair. She hadn't cried. Not once. Not after the first shot. Not after the retreat. But now, as she watched Jed walk the land like it was sacred, her eyes welled. Not from fear, but from the unfamiliar shape of safety. Ruth cooked breakfast that morning like it was any other day: cornmeal, eggs, and a pan of beans simmering over the fire. But when she set the table, she laid an extra plate. No one questioned it. They all knew what it meant. It wasn't for the men who came with hate in their saddlebags. It was for the woman who had crossed deserts, carried life through pain, and earned her place not through blood, but through sheer will. That empty plate was a vow. There would always be room here. Later, as the sun climbed, Claire walked the perimeter with Jed, not because she needed protection, but because she had something to say. She stopped near the cottonwood tree where she'd once buried the boots she fled in. "I thought I'd have to keep running my whole life," she whispered. Jed didn't speak. He just looked at her, steady, open. She glanced down at the baby in her arms. "But I want her to grow up knowing we stayed." Jed nodded. "Then we build it right. Together." That evening, they carve Eliza's name into the wooden beam over the barn door, beneath the brand Jed's father once burned there. A new kind of legacy, not one built on cattle or coin, but on protection, on purpose, on a quiet promise made in the shadows of danger. And long after the wind blew the tracks from the earth and the hills fell silent again, Hollow Bend remained. Because something had taken root there, something deeper than vengeance, stronger than fear, a future, and they were ready to live it. Seasons passed. The heat of summer gave way to the crisp bite of autumn, and Hollow Bend changed with it. What once had been a ranch marked by solitude became a place spoken of in town with curious reverence. Folks who had never bothered to look Jed Crane in the eye now tipped their hats when he came in for supplies. They didn't know the whole story, but they had heard whispers of a woman saved, of a child born in a barn, of riders who never returned. Claire planted a garden behind the barn, corn, squash, a patch of sunflowers that swayed like flags in the wind. Ruth taught other women from the valley how to shoot, how to stand their ground without needing anyone's permission. And Jed, who had once spoken more to shadows than to people, began carving toys, not just for Eliza, but for the children who came through the ranch with their mothers, drawn by the scent of safety and the strength of the story passed from hand to hand. Hollow Bend became more than a home. It became a sanctuary, not because of the walls or the weapons, but because of what had been born there, literally and metaphorically. A child who represented the rebirth of a man, the healing of a woman, and the quiet resilience of a land that refused to be hardened by hate. There were no signs on the road, no laws declaring its purpose, but those who needed it always found it. And as Eliza learned to walk, then to speak, her laughter filled the very bones of the house. She grew not in fear, but in freedom, held by arms that once carried sorrow, guided by hearts that had faced death and chosen life. And every year, on the night the stars aligned, just like they had the night she was born, Jed would take her hand, walk her to the barn, and tell her the story again. The story of how she came to be, of the woman who carried her, of the man who opened the gate. Because in the Old West, legends weren't always made with guns or gold. Sometimes they were written in hay and sweat and blood, in a barn lit by lantern light, in a voice that said, "You're safe now," and in the quiet cry of a newborn girl who would grow to prove that even in a land built on hardship, love, when fiercely defended, could take root and last forever. In the vast silence of the West, where the land often remembers pain more than peace, a child was born in a barn during a storm. And in that moment, without ceremony, without permission, something shifted. Not just in the dirt beneath Jed Crane's boots, or in the air that wrapped Hollow Bend like a blanket, but in the soul of a man who thought life had nothing left to give. What began with a woman collapsing at his gate ended with the rebirth of everything he thought he had lost: purpose, belonging, and the raw, unfiltered power of choosing to care again. This wasn't a story about rescue. It was a story about response, about what happens when we stop guarding our wounds and start using them to protect others. Jed didn't ask to become a guardian. Claire didn't ask to become a symbol of strength. Ruth didn't ask to carry wisdom that could save a home. And Eliza, she simply arrived. Yet, through one act of compassion, all of them found each other. And together, they built something no bullet could tear down, a legacy rooted in trust. We often believe strength comes with noise, fists raised, voices loud. But the West has always known better. It knows that real strength is quiet. It's in holding the line when no one is watching. It's in placing a rifle down when your arms ache and still standing guard. It's in rocking a child to sleep knowing the world outside is unforgiving, but that she will never face it alone. And it's in opening a door when a stranger falls at your gate and not letting them leave broken. What happened to Hollow Bend wasn't just survival. It was the rewriting of what family means, of what it looks like to stay, to rise not just for yourself, but for the ones who were never given the chance to stand. And that is a truth worth remembering, no matter where you come from. Because sometimes, a barn isn't just a place to rest. It's where life begins again, for everyone. If this story reached your heart, let it keep going. Subscribe to the channel to walk alongside more stories that matter. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice adds to the legacy. And if you believe in second chances, in chosen families, and in the quiet power of doing the right thing, like this video. Because someone, somewhere, may be standing at the gate, and your story might be the one that helps them knock.